unless you're a full-time Pope follower, you're say you write for a Catholic publication or you teach at a public university, virtually everything you know or think you know about any Pope, especially this one, is coming to you second or third hand from the media. And so very often what he actually says is something different from what he in fact says. Michael quoted his statement about the dung of the devil, and you quoted the actual statement that Pope Francis said. But if you Google that, what you'll see is that Pope Francis called capitalism the dung of the devil, though, of course, in the speech, he doesn't use the word capitalism. That's what's odd about many of the things that Pope Francis says. He very, very rarely actually uses the word capitalism. I think that perhaps is deliberate. My favorite example, though, of sort of media distortion has nothing to do with these topics. Last year, Pope Francis spoke to the Pontifical Academies of Science and was talking about how the Catholic and Catholic theology understands God. It was reported in the English-speaking press that the Pope had said to these scientists that God is not a divine being. All right, just let that sink in. So the Pope said that God is not a divine being, right? So when I saw this, if I could make money just finding media distortions, I would try to monetize it. But I thought, this can't possibly be right. The Pope would say this. So I went to the Vatican news site. Thought I'll look at the English translation there. It was there. That's where the media had gotten it. So you can't necessarily trust the Vatican news site on these things, at least in the short term. So I went to the original speech, which was in Italian. And what he had said is, God is not a demiurgos. God is not a demiurge. Now, there's a technical philosophical term that essentially says God is not just the sort of top member of the universe. He's a transcendent creator over everything that is. Well, it's just sort of straightforward Christian and Catholic theology that once translated, like a game of telephone internationally, had the Pope saying God is not a divine being. So whenever you're tempted to think, okay, I know for sure what the Pope is saying, just remember that. That's how bad it can actually get. But what we're going to talk about here for a few minutes today, and much, in fact, of what I wanted to say has already been said, is this idea of capitalism through the eyes of Pope Francis. And so that's really what I want to focus on. I mentioned that Pope Francis very rarely actually uses the word capitalism. In fact, until yesterday, I hadn't been able to find an example of him using the term at all. It turns out if the story is to be trusted, a year ago, or rather 2 years ago in 2013, he gave a talk to a soup kitchen in Rome in which he referred to something called savage capitalism. So I thought, okay, perfect, here we go. But when you look to see what he meant, the way he defined this term, savage capitalism, was the logic of profit at any cost. All right, so that's a kind of very specific idea. We could debate, is that a fair interpretation of capitalism as it's normally defended or not? But it's clear to see that that's clearly what he had in mind. As President Garvey said, many of the things that the Pope writes, including in this most recent encyclical Laudato Si, in his previous apostolic letter, he doesn't say a lot about these particular things. In fact, in his apostolic letter, Evangelii Gaudium, if I'm correct, it was only about 8 pages in which he discusses economic topics at all. But he does say this from pages 53 to 60. He says that we must say no to, and this is direct quotes, to an economy of exclusion. We must say no to the new idolatry of money. We must say no to a financial system that rules rather than serves. And we must say no to the inequality which spawns violence. Okay, so if you're a defender of the free market, ask yourself the question, do you disagree with that? Anything that he said here? Would you say no to an economy of exclusion or to an idolatry of money or to an inequality that spawns violence? It's a specific kind of inequality. He does, however, say in Evangelii Gaudium, he specifically condemns what he calls the absolute autonomy of markets. And this is a term that he's used several times. And as Michael said, that actually Pope Francis and Pope Benedict have also used a term very much like that. The same document, I want to reiterate these things, even though you've already heard him once this afternoon. He says, he refers to those who continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. Such a view, he writes, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. More generally, he says this, we can no longer trust in the unseen forces and in the invisible hand of the market. So I think it would be fair to say, I'd love to try to sort of spin this, and some people try to do this, especially those of us who think of the live alternatives, that economic freedom is the best thing to go. You'd like to sort of spin this away, but I do think at least Pope Francis has an impression. Let me fix this here. It looks like it sort of clicked off on me. I can keep going. Yeah, here we go. You got it. Michael was telling me beforehand that this is the reason he doesn't use PowerPoint. So there you go. You've got another reason. Stick with the yellow pad. But I do think it's fair to say that his view of capitalism, at least as he understands it, is generally not positive. As President Garvey says in Laudato Si, he does have positive things to say about business and its role in creating wealth and in creating jobs. But I think that's the best that we could say. Taking together, so his apostolic letter and his most recent encyclical, and then many of his extemporaneous and written speeches, I think that the better thing to do is to just focus on what Pope Francis primarily is saying, what he's intending to say and what he does in fact say, because he says many things over and over. And so I think we can take these as sort of recurring themes in his own thought on this subject. He speaks frequently about what he calls speculation. In fact, he used it last week speaking in Italy, I believe, to a cooperative bank association. It's actually in Rome. He talks about economic ideologies that deny human dignity, that embrace selfishness and greed. He talks, again, a lot about the idolatry of money and ideologies that idolatrize money. A lot about greed, as we said, comes up again and again. Michael said a lot about inequality. This doesn't distinguish him from virtually any other pope in the 20th or now the 21st century. He does invoke, as you heard a minute ago, the idea of the invisible hand. He said, to paraphrase it, we can no longer trust in the sort of guidance of this invisible hand, which is, of course, the term that Adam Smith came up with. Interestingly, Smith, so far as I can tell, only ever used the term twice, but that's what most people remember that he said. And behind all this, I think this is a sort of crucial point. Whenever Pope Francis is talking about these things, invariably, he has one subject in mind. It's poverty. Poverty is precisely the thing that motivates everything that he says about these. And if you tend to be very skeptical of the things Pope Francis says about the economy, at least understand this, that the things he says not simply because of some kind of ideological predilection, but because he is profoundly concerned about the poor. And as President Garvey says, the reason he took the name Francis is because of his concern about the poor. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say, as someone, my Twitter handle, incidentally, is FreeMarketJ, so just so you sort of know where I'm coming from on these questions, that some of the things he says feel sometimes like a caricature, like, well, that's not anything I would ever defend, and it's certainly not anything that any of the people that I admire would ever defend. And so the question is, where does he specifically get the ideas that he has about what free market capitalism or entrepreneurial capitalism actually are? And I think there's actually a fairly clear reason for that, and it requires us to make a useful distinction. Many of the things he says, in fact, many of the things he says about the global financial system, about the financial crisis, as Marion said, I wrote a book in 2013 on the financial crisis. This was an abiding interest of mine. And frankly, many of the things he says about the financial system ring true when talking about that. It's just that when I read him on that, they ring true to me, not as a critique of free market capitalism, but as a critique of something we might call cronyism or corporatism. And insofar as you sort of understand what he talks about and what he's saying in that light, that if you say, okay, what he is connoting, right, or he's denoting, what he's referring to is not the philosophical views of Adam Smith or even F.A. Hayek, but the corporatism and the cronyism that often stands in for those things in some degree in the United States, but certainly in many countries in South America. And this, I think, is really, really important because Pope Francis, as an Argentine, has experienced for his entire life a particularly brutal form of what I would call a sort of hard corporatism, if you want to call it that. Many of you may not know much about Argentina. I've not been there, but I have many friends who have and have talked to them a lot about the country. And I think there's a sort of crucial thing to realize about Pope Francis's experience and the things that he says when he's speaking about things like the socio-economic system in terms like this that he uses fairly vaguely. In 1900, Argentina was one of the world's 10 wealthiest nations in terms of GDP per capita. one of the 10 wealthiest. Because of this, there was massive immigration from Northern Europe in the early 20th century into Argentina. Now, you don't think of it this way, of course, anymore, and it's largely the result of Juan Perón and his wife, who came into power in an ideology that's very difficult to describe in that sort of left-right American spectrum. But you could sort of think of it as a populist leftism, which is in many ways is a kind of an aristocratic contempt for the commerce class and for the bourgeoisie, and a highly populist rhetoric which appeals to the common people, but nevertheless implements political programs that are essentially a form of cronyism, in which large economic actors work in collusion with the state to enrich themselves, but not to enrich their common people. If you think about what Pope Francis is saying in that light, and think about his experience of cronyism in Argentina, much of what he says starts to make sense. Now, I don't want to say that he's clearly making these distinctions. He does not, anywhere so far as I know, distinguish between the type of cronyism that's still rife in Argentina and the type of, say, free market capitalism that you'd get in some place like Hong Kong, or the type of general free economy that you'd have in a place like South Korea. He doesn't make these distinctions, and I would very much like to see him make those. Nevertheless, I think it's absolutely important in reading what he says to understand his experience. Now, what about Argentina? Well, Argentina is now, alas, an economic basket case. In the most recent Index of Economic Freedom, comes in 169th out of 178 countries on the planet in terms of economic freedom. So it's between the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Congo, right? So not doing very well. In fact, if you're in South America and the Caribbean, the only countries that do worse are Venezuela and Cuba. So whatever you want to say about Argentina, this is not a bastion of free market capitalism. It's a very powerful, overbearing state, several large, presumably private economic actors, in which massive amounts of inequality, not the kind of benign inequality that defines, say, everyone in this room and Bill Gates, right? But a malignant form of inequality that's the form of inequality of plutocrats in cahoots with the state and peasantry living in shanty towns. Now, if that is your picture of capitalism of the global economy, then what Pope Francis says absolutely makes sense. So here's the question. So what to do? Imagine, for instance, that you're a Catholic philosopher or you're an economist and you've studied these things. You've sort of looked at the empirical details. You've looked at different political economies. You have no delusions that any economic system is going to bring about heaven on earth. You have no sense that there's a utopia. Nevertheless, you think on empirical grounds that economic systems and economic freedom as it tends to be defended in terms of rule of law, private property rights, low levels of corruption, a minimally virtuous populace, and wide-ranging economic freedom is the best of the live economic alternatives for lifting large numbers of people out of absolute poverty. That is, if you're aware, for instance, of the many things that you can see at humanprogress.org, if you follow it on Twitter almost every single day. These are sort of empirical facts. So we're not in a position simply of having to analyze different competing economic ideologies. I think ultimately we're in a position of asking a sort of empirical question. What mix of juridical structures and institutions and economic structures is most conducive to human flourishing and is most conducive to lifting large numbers of people out of poverty? What if you're a faithful Catholic and an Orthodox Catholic and you're convinced that it's free economic systems that do this? What are you to do? This is the sort of dilemma. And I think to understand what one needs to do, you have to actually understand a few things about the way in which authority works in the Catholic Church and the authority of the magisterium. President Garvey has actually almost entirely covered what I was going to say here, but you have to make distinctions. So everyone, at least everyone that's not Catholic, so far as I can tell, all of my evangelical friends, if I ask them they haven't studied Christian theology and I ask them what does papal infallibility entails, tend to think, well, it just means that everything the Pope says is infallible. Of course, that's not true, and you can discover this in about 5 minutes with a really good Google search, but that tends to be people's impressions of how these things work. Nevertheless, there is a detailed sort of historical body of texts that have come to be called Catholic social teaching that by convention start with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum and continue to the present, in which the popes are applying particular themes both from Catholic theology, but also from natural law, to the sort of current abiding questions of economics and politics. And I would sort of refer to the central abiding, and I would say infallible core of these things as the principles that you see articulated and presupposed in these documents of Catholic social teaching. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to think that Catholic social teaching equals some detailed Catholic political policy. It's not as if it articulates in detail the precise details, for instance, of how a tax system should be put together or how immigration policy should be put together in a way that's both just and prudent. It provides a set of principles that I would argue actually provide a wonderful lens and a clarifying lens for thinking through these issues. But it doesn't sort of provide, okay, here's the Catholic political position. And so that's why Catholics of good faith can nevertheless differ and disagree on particular political topics, while nevertheless adhering to these principles of Catholic social teaching. Here's how Pope John Paul II put it, and he's not saying anything I don't think that's idiosyncratic in this regard. So the Church's social doctrine is not a third way between liberal capitalism and Marxist collectivism, not even a possible alternative to other solutions less radically opposed to one another. Rather, it constitutes a category of its own. In some ways, it doesn't mean that it's orthogonal. It doesn't mean that the principles of Catholic social teaching, therefore, they're sort of hermetically sealed from economic concerns. That'd be a sort of fundamental mistake. What it means is that they provide a set of moral and philosophical categories by which, if you're a faithful Catholic, you ought to reflect on these things. So for instance, the intrinsic dignity of the human person, the universal destination of goods, solidarity, subsidiarity, the common good. These are categories that you must and ought to bring to all of these questions. That's not going to answer every single question about, say, what level the minimum wage ought to be set. That's a prudential question based upon your sort of analysis and conclusions based on the sort of empirical details as far as you understand them. Pope Benedict XVI, so Pope Francis's immediate predecessor, actually put it very nicely this way before he was Pope, when he was the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Here's how he put it. He was talking about morality and economics and how he thought these things ought to interact. And I take this to be, yes, Catholic social teaching is not a third way. It's not a completely filled out political system, but neither is it irrelevant to moral questions. Here's how he puts it. He said, a morality that believes itself able to dispense with the technical knowledge of economic laws is not morality, but moralism. As such, it is the antithesis of morality. And then he goes on to put it exactly the other way. He says, an economics that believes that it can dispense with moral knowledge and moral principles is not economics, but economism. What we need is a maximum of economics and a maximum of moral reflection, so that when these things come together, we have a whole that's much greater than the sum of their parts. That's what I would say the task, at least for the faithful Catholic, who is a faithful son or daughter of the church, who's also appreciative of the good that economic freedom brings to human beings. That I would say ought to be our goal. It would not to be to sort of separate these things. It would not to be to say, well, Catholic social teaching is one thing, but economics just involves sort of empirical questions. Rather, it's this. It's distinguishing the economic ideologies that Pope Francis talks about, that Michael talked about, from the empirical results and discoveries and the theoretical insights of economics, and integrating those things with the perennial principles of Catholic social teaching. And I would argue if that's done and that's done properly, a faithful Catholic can also be an advocate of economic freedom.